So I'm Kristin Morris. I'm conducting this interview for the Computer History Museum. This interview will become part of the collection, the VMware Founders Collection at the Computer History Museum. Ganesh, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for having me on.
First of all, please say your full name for the record.
Ganesh Venkitachalam.
And tell us a little bit about your education and career path leading you to VMware.
Yeah, so I actually graduated with a bachelor's in CS back in India. My brother actually sort of pushed me towards computers actually. I did not know much about this. But then it got really, like when I got into my bachelor's, I got really interested, especially by my fourth year when we were, writing code up the wazoo. So then I came out to the US, went to Stony Brook, got my master's, graduated in 1998. And then my first job out of college was at IBM. Java virtual machines were like very big back then, right? It was in 90s, right? So I was in the IBM Java virtual machine team and the Linux kernel performance team. I did like 2 stints there. Part of my career background up to that point was that x86 is a very difficult processor to work with. And my master's thesis was using some obscure capabilities of the x86 instruction set to provide a secure computing environment. And I was leveraging the instruction set in ways that hadn't been done before, right? So it was pretty interesting. And so part of my master's was that. And that actually was part of the reason why I got into IBM Java Virtual Machine. They had a just-in-time compiler. They could use people with x86 expertise and so on, right? So that was up to IBM. And then from IBM, I came to VMware.
So how did you get the job at VMware?
So that's actually a really interesting story. As I said earlier, my master's thesis was all about x86 and secure programming kind of thing. And I met one of the founders of VMware, Ed Bunyon, at SOSP 99. My master's thesis actually ended up as a paper in SOSP and was highly relevant to what VMware was doing. So Ed and I ended up talking. And Ed basically sort of interviewed me a little bit on the spot and said, you need to come over for an interview. And I interviewed in 99 August with VMware. That sounds about right, 99 August, something like that. And then I joined. Mm-hmm. And part of my interview process was actually funny because Ed made me present my entire master's thesis, which is a little unusual for a master's student. PhD candidates always have to pitch their thesis. Not so much master's, but the topic was so relevant. And I was explaining the whole thing. And I still remember a comment by Mendel saying, I was actually a reviewer for your paper. It's fun to see somebody else read through all that goop in x86. I was like, yeah, it was fun.
So you had gone deep into that technical part that Mendel really loves, right? That deep technical knowledge.
Right. I think that's almost entirely why it was like a really good fit for both parties, so to say. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just to pause a little bit on that career trajectory, did you think about staying more in an academic setting? No.
Never. I always wanted to build products that get used by people. Academia felt it just is not my thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because you can, in a company like VMware especially, you can actually do research that actually ends up being part of products that are used in data centers all over the world or by people all over the world and so on, right? I was always much more interested in doing something innovative that's actually practical and not academia for academia's sake. And I have to appreciate this. Like, I got ample opportunity at VMware to do research that actually shipped as product.
So what were some of the projects you worked on in your early years at VMware?
A whole series of things. Back then, x86 was a beast to virtualize, right? Because the processor, nowadays, the processor has support for virtualization. By 2005, 6, 8, it was like very common for processors to have virtualization support. Back then, it was like indistinguishable from magic because the CPU was thought to be, x86 CPU was thought to be unvirtualizable back then, right? And I got dropped straight into the hypervisor team. And Ed was actually my hiring manager and mentor and so on. Ed and a person named Ole Agason. Ole was the first VMware fellow. So I got to work on the core virtualization platform before there was CPU support. This actually is slew of interesting problems, right? Because performance problems are, always there with virtualization before the CPU support came up. So I worked a lot on performance. I worked a lot on I/O virtualization, memory management, and in the early days, one of the coolest projects I worked on was support for multiprocessor virtual machines. Back when I joined in 2000, there was no multiprocessor VM. So VMware had virtualized the x86, first company to do so, but it was a single processor VM. And then when the direction changed to server side and enterprise workloads, obviously we had to support SMP virtual machines, right? And so I got to work on the locking and concurrency for multiprocessor VMs on x86. This was like really a blast because for a long time, all of us in that virtualization team were sort of pondering how to do this in a way that's fast, efficient, and easy to program, like to create a concurrency model, right? So I got a chance to work on that in, I want to say, 2003 timeframe. That was one of the best early projects that I got. And I'm actually surprised that Ed, Ole, and Mendel and others sort of handed it to a kid out of college. It was a pretty critical project too back then.
Why do you think that they handed it to you?
It was a gradual thing, right? The very first week I joined, Ed basically, it was Ed or Mendel, one of them basically, Ed actually. They said, why don't you go look at networking performance? I did a bunch of work on that, and then it turned out well. And then gradually, I think it's mostly Ed who kept giving me like larger and larger projects, and by 3 years in, he trusted me really. And Ole too, same exact trajectory, right? So he started me small and then gradually kept giving me like larger and larger things, and at some point I was like, yeah, I can do this.
Going from there to, like you said, more looking further beyond sort of the scope, like during those years, right? VMware had a pretty narrow scope, right?
Yep.
At its founding, and
Very, yeah.
Can you describe how that scope kind of got wider with the
So,
projects you were working on?
This is VMware actually had I don't want to say plan, but a vision, right? Because one of the things, when VMware started initially, it was all VMware Workstation. ESX was not a thing, right? Like it didn't exist. The first version of ESX shipped in 2001 or so, something like that, right? But as it turned out, at least the founders and probably most of the senior engineers had an inkling of where this is going. Mendel definitely had a vision. Let me tell you a story about my interview at VMware. So I interviewed in 99, second half of 99, right? During the interview process, Mendel was one of the people who interviewed me. Mendel kind of said, Ed asked me to interview you. I don't really do interviews. I don't interview people well. Why don't you ask me questions? So I asked Mendel, one of the questions I had asked Mendel was this exact question, like workstation, small market, where do you see all of this going? Mendel basically said, well, we have a vision that people are going to build large data centers, and in these large data centers, you could consider putting virtual machines and then rent them out. And I looked at Mendel like he was an alien, because you had to remember, this is 1999, and he's talking about people renting out virtual machines in a data center. I looked at it like literally like he was an alien. I was like, I don't understand what he's saying. That's okay, right? And I joined anyway because the technology was so compelling. So, but you see where this is going. This is exactly where VMware went. And in fact, this begat cloud. This is exactly what cloud is. And Mendel had the foresight 10 years before AWS S3 or EC2 got announced to say that's where this should go. So part of that was like that vision. And then we started shipping ESX in 2001 time, 2000 actually. 2000 is when 1.0 shipped. And I think the plan was always there. And I was lucky enough to be in the hypervisor team to grow with that expanded charter of workstation is thing one. We're going to get into ESX, servers and multiprocessor virtual machines, vMotion and DRS and all those, extremely powerful capabilities, on and on and on. So I just grew with that expansion.
Can you talk a little bit about, you've mentioned about the leadership in that cohort of people that you're working with. What about your teammates, your colleagues that you were working with? Can you tell us a little bit?
It was
how you
actually
worked?
very interesting. So, it was my first Bay Area job too. So the way I think this is very consciously done. At least I'd like to believe it was very conscious. The way the company was back then, it was very bimodal in seniority and age. Back in 2000, there were a handful of, I'd say, under 10 really senior people. We are talking about Mendel, Ed, Scott Devine, Edward Wong, Ole, Mike Nelson, these guys. The rest were all kids like me, right? So it was this conscious preference for college hiring with all these young people. It was invariably fun, right? And I speak of Ed as a senior engineer, but Ed was actually not that old back then. He was definitely under 30, right? So it was like very sort of vibrant, fun environment, with the senior people sort of guiding the team on like work, but then all the young guys would hang out. It was basically a blast. We would be here on Saturdays for sure. There's a whole set of people who would go running, biking, all these extracurricular outside the work things, right? So the environment was pretty fun. It was intense, for sure. There were high expectations, but it was also sort of balanced with a lot of fun. Like I can tell you, like one of the things that we used to do to people back then was whenever anybody got married, we threw them in the turtle pond. And the turtle pond was absolutely disgusting. And then after you come out of the turtle pond and take a shower, you wear a costume for a day. So I was a Mexican wrestler for a day and stinking for about a couple of days. So it was just fun valley startup back then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the way that you acclimated yourself to the Bay Area high-tech culture.
It wasn't difficult at all for me. Just because I was really obsessed with tech and computers when I was in my 20s. Like I couldn't think of anything else. I was basically in front of a computer 6-7 days a week, 12 hours a week kind of thing, either for work or for learning or something like that, right? So, and all the people around were like, were very similar. And I also was lucky enough to have undergrad friends from back in India take a very similar journey as mine. Kids who went to masters, do their masters in the US, ended up in the Bay Area. So I had at least 4 friends here from undergrad and really good friends at work too. It wasn't much of a transition for me. It's just fun.
I know that I get the impression often that many of these Silicon Valley companies in those kinds of years, sort of early to teenage years, if you will, of the company, it is like a college campus.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it was.
Food, fun,
celebration, Wednesday lunches, beer bash, all kinds of stuff, and parties.
So I don't want to fast forward too fast. You were at VMware for a stint of about 12 years.
Yes, and then I came back. Yeah.
And then you came back.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit about the transition you made when leading up to and then deciding to leave VMware to start your new venture?
Yeah. So what happened is that in 2006-07 timeframe, along with a principal engineer named Boris Weissman, Boris and I started a project called Record Replay. This was by far the toughest thing I've ever done in my career, including till now. Technically speaking, this was just incredibly difficult. So the thesis for that project was something like this. A CPU is perfectly deterministic. As it turns out, they're not. But there is an academic paper back in the 70s, 80s maybe, about how you can record and replay the instruction stream of a CPU, right? And then the thesis being CPUs are deterministic. Therefore, if you capture all the inputs and outputs of the CPU and record the inputs and the inputs to the CPU, not output, right? They record the inputs of the CPU, and then you can replay these inputs exactly at the right time, so to say. Then the CPU will do the same exact thing the second time. Think of it like Stratus computers where there are 2 CPUs doing identical things. And so there is an academic paper saying this is possible. Try doing that on x86 is a whole other game, right? Because as it turns out, x86 is not deterministic in many ways. there are droppings in various registers where floating point bits are there, and then when you do an F save, these bits end up in memory, and then once you have sort of difference in memory, all bits are off kind of thing, right? So our goal, Boris and me, like our project was, let's see if we can take an x86 instruction stream, record the inputs with enough precision so that you can replay the instruction stream with 100% precision, but then take that stream, ship it over the network to a different data center, different building, whatever, and replay it on a different virtual machine over there, so that when the first building catches fire, this second copy can take over seamlessly, right? So we were building Stratus in software. So that was just incredibly challenging, right? So Boris and I started working on the core virtualization part. Mike Nelson and Dan Scales were working on sort of shipping it to a second data center and like making it come up the same way on the other side, so to say, right? So it was like a really exciting project, but it was also like a big slog. The whole thing took 2.5 to 3 years to ship from beginning to end, from inception to actually shipping product. But the cool thing was that at that point, I would say it's the only project that I have led which was indistinguishable from Magic. All of VMware was indistinguishable from Magic from the early days, but this is one project where people looked at it and said, how does that work, right? So that was really cool. So that project shipped in about 2008. And at that point, I was kind of done with the hypervisor. I was basically exhausted because it was such a long slog to get this thing going. So in 2008, Boris and I, again, like as a pair, left the hypervisor team, did an on-prem database as a service. This was basically package software that customers would deploy on-prem, but once they deploy it, they would have a database as a service offering on-prem. And we shipped that in 2011. It turned out that that was at least 5 to 10 years ahead of the market, if you will, right? So today there are products you can buy to do database as a service on-prem. Back then there was nothing. We thought we were onto something, but it was just too early. It is what it is, right? So that product was like sort of a shaky situation, but we shipped it. And at that point, it was time to take a step back and evaluate, okay, I'm done with the hypervisor. I did some as a service thing on-prem. Do I want to do something different? And that right around then was when flash memory was really taking off, right? So Nutanix had shipped, Pure Storage was out, and so on. So Boris and I looked at the market, and we both left. And then we started researching the storage market together. For about 6 months, we were like, walking the earth, trying to find people to talk storage to. Somehow we got hooked onto flash memory. And then we left. After we left and we did this, we met a couple of guys named Hugo Patterson and Brian Boyles. They were co-founders of Data Domain. Actually, Hugo was the CTO, Brian was a co-founder, and Sasala Reddy, who was the second CTO of Data Domain. So all of us hung out together. We felt like we had chemistry. So we ended up starting a storage startup to do what is now called disaggregated HCI. So we shipped our first we shipped the industry's first disaggregated HCI product in 2016. But really, the trigger that made me leave VMware was, on the one hand, flash memory was interesting and things are happening. On the other hand, I was sort of done with the hypervisor. New opportunity, let me try something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the products that Datrium developed, what was attractive about that to VMware in the long run? So
this was a two-step process. What happened was that we shipped an on-prem disaggregated HCI product in 2016. As it turned out, we were probably a little too late for that product. Depending on your perspective, we were either a little too late because it was not cloud, or we needed a lot more capital to go after the prem market and compete with VMware and Nutanix at that time, right? So at that point it was a two-horse race, and we were probably a year too late for that particular race, and we were not playing in the cloud, which is bad in a different way, right? So what happened was that we took the product we had on-prem, the disaggregated HCI product, and we saw that VMware Cloud on AWS was taking off. So we basically pivoted that entire software stack to run in the cloud and solve disaster recovery and now ransomware recovery, right? So all the IP we had built up to that point, we basically leveraged, put it in the cloud, and built a very, very sort of unique disaster recovery / ransomware recovery solution. And in the first quarter of shipping that product, we got like a lot of customers, VMware customers. And at that point, I think I'm guessing, I don't know the full story, but I'm guessing it was Raghu and Mark Lohmeyer who saw that we are driving customers to VMC. And I had enough connections. We ended up talking to Vijay Ramachandran, who is the VP of Product Management, John Gilmartin at some point, and so on. We ended up talking, and it was pretty obvious that VMware has benefits from this product. And over a 6-month period, we ended up getting acquired in July 2020.
When you were acquired, kind of how did it get folded into VMware? How much of the product went straight into VMware?
All of it. All of it, pretty much. The Prem product didn't, obviously. The Prem product we had to end of life in this pivot to cloud. It was a pivot to cloud, right? So the Prem product kind of end of life. But in terms of the cloud service that we built, that is actually what VMware acquired us for almost, right? Not almost. That is what VMware acquired us for. And then that product carried forward. We have been enhancing that product with like really new capabilities, like specifically around ransomware recovery and so on in the last 2 years. And it's highly successful now in VMware.
What was it like to come back to VMware?
To be honest, it was a little bit of shock because when I left in 2012 February, my memory says we had about 10,000 people-ish. And my memory on revenue says it was something around 4 or 5 billion, maybe 4 billion, something like that. So 8 years later, I come back, the company had 34,000 people, and I'm like just walking around the campus, it's like a workout. It was actually like pretty shocking how big it had gotten, because I knew all the tech stuff that VMware was doing, but I didn't like follow like number of people, that kind of thing. It's huge.
Had the company culture changed very much?
Yeah. When I joined, I was, I believe, the 105th employee, something like that. Now we are pushing 39,000, something around there. And when I came back in 2020, it was like 34,000 maybe. So obviously back then, when I joined, it was like, it's like what you said, it's like a college environment, like everybody's having fun and a blast, right? And then it sort of matured into a, for the lack of a better word, a real company. By 2004, it was still like only 400 people, but it's a rock solid, hot startup. And that kept going like that till about 2008-9, I would say. It still had a startup-y feeling. By 2012, it was more like an established gorilla, maybe not quite a gorilla, but it was like a really established, solid enterprise software company, right? But it still had a little bit of that little company vibe, and I felt it probably because I knew everyone, right? In 2012, that was a state, but now it's just huge. So all the things that you need in a big company, like all the functions are like sort of mapped out as responsibilities for various people. You could back then go walk into the marketing VP's office and say, I had a question about VMworld. Can I tweak this session to be 15 minutes instead of 40? And at least you could have a conversation. Mm-hmm. Now just take VMworld planning, right? It's like it starts 6 months ahead of time, and it's like very regimented of necessity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's just a very different company now.
So in your work now, are you still focused? Where is your role focused right now?
I manage the data protection portfolio at VMware. VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery is what VMware acquired Datrium for. That portfolio, like from my personal perspective, that portfolio expanded. I now manage Site Recovery Manager, VMware Site Recovery, all the sort of data protection, ingest type APIs and so on. And of course, VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. So I basically ended up managing all of VMware's DP portfolio on-prem and in the cloud. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's very relevant to my background in the last 8 years, since 2016, since we made the pivot. So 7 years, mm-hmm. Right? It's very relevant, that background. But my first iteration at VMware and the second iteration have nothing to do with each other. Mm-hmm. Yeah, completely different. Yeah.
How much of your time is spent doing the technical work that brought you to VMware in the first place?
Nearly zero. I'm a manager now. So it's almost nothing really. But I do get flashes of good technical conversations with engineers, which I really enjoy. I learn something in each one of these, but very little technical hands-on work anymore.
I have noticed in my research that your work is often cited in other people's work. And I wonder if you have that phenomenon at VMware of people pinging you or coming up to you and saying, you know,
Yeah, definitely.
can you give me some insight on this?
When you say cited, do you mean academic papers?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that has happened to me too. Like, in fact, I graduated from Stony Brook. Stony Brook has a experimental computer science laboratory, which is where I worked. In fact, a couple of my papers are actually required reading in that lab now, around the record replay project and virtualization, I/O virtualization, right? So that kind of thing happens. In my first iteration, again, like people used to ask me about, how does this happen, etc., even within VMware and outside VMware. So it happens. In my second iteration, almost nothing. Again, I'm a manager now, dark side.
Where do you see this kind of disaster recovery? Like, what is the path? What is the next 5 years? You've said before, like often you were looking at something and maybe you were a few years ahead of the curve. Are you looking ahead? What do you see ahead of the curve now for that?
Absolutely. So our belief, product strategy belief, no, it's not. It's more than a belief. Our product strategy thesis right now is that ransomware recovery is going to be a very key capability for the DR and backup industry. And right now, we have a product that is really, again, extremely uniquely differentiated. It is, in my opinion, at least 18 months ahead of competition, at least, right? So in the tech industry, that's a very large moat. 18 months is a very large moat in the tech industry. We have built some really clever integrations that make these products really practically useful to recover from ransomware attacks on the one hand and differentiated from competition on the other hand. So with what's on the truck that we sell, we're already like quite a bit ahead of competition, but we have things in the works that I hope will leapfrog competition even more. And the engineering team I work with is just amazing, and product management. Like the product team I work with is just amazing. And that's the other thing that I really like about VMware. The quality of engineering and the talent in engineering, it's still there. It's still like as good as back then and so on, right? So that's great. And that is something that we plan to leverage.
And make them work just as hard.
It's not the same as back in, it's another funny story. Like Scott Devine was telling me one day that this was 1998, before I had joined. This is Scott's story, not mine. In 1998, of course, they all slept here almost, I'm sure, right? I'm sure they were working 16-hour days, right? So Scott told me that one day, Saturday evening, he goes out at 5 p.m. He was at work. Ed is at work. All of them are at work. Saturday evening, 5 p.m., he goes out and he has a nice dinner with his girlfriend or something like that and comes back at 8 p.m. to work. And Ed is super irritated at Scott saying, where were you? So it's not quite like that anymore.
You can have a dinner break on Saturday. I think you've already touched on this a little bit, but are there other products that you would point to that you're particularly proud of having worked on?
The record replay product, the record replay piece was technology. There were two products that came out of it. One was this fault tolerance product that was trying to sort of mimic what Stratus does in software, if you will, right? So that was for the enterprise market. The other really cool product that came out of record replay technology was a debugging tool. This is sort of the dream of every developer, if you will. When you have a bug, again, if you think of what we did, we had a way of faithfully recording the execution stream and then replaying the execution stream. Now, if you can think that the application this has in debugging, right? You can, and the performance loss was very, very minimal. You could run enterprise software production workload with it. It was that good, right? So one of the other ideas we had, actually the idea was again from an academic paper, we just made it reality, was that why don't we ship a debugging product where you could record the entire instruction sequence and your QA team would always be recording. And when there's a bug, you give it over to a developer, the developer replays the instruction stream, boom, there's your bug, 100% reproducibility, and then even cooler, you could conceptually walk back in the instruction stream and figure out exactly what chain of events led to the bug. This is just amazing, right? So the technology was, again, like the underpinning was, me and Boris and Slava, Vyacheslav Malyugin, sorry, I should have mentioned him first, right? The three of us were like deeply in this. Among 10 other engineers, but the three of us were, I think, the leads, if you will. When we shipped the debugging product, that product was actually led by an engineer. He's still with us. He's in fact in my team, a guy named E. Christopher Lewis. He was the lead for shipping the debugging product. And it was just shocking how good it was. So the thing that I'm proud of was it actually was used by developers exactly the way E and others envisioned it, to a degree of success that you can't imagine otherwise. So I was actually in a park one day in Mountain View, and I was wearing some t-shirt that said record replay or something like that. This developer from Netscape came to me and said, "Hey, do you know about VMware record replay?" I'm like, "Yes, of course I know, but I'm part of the key engineers who built it, right? I know about record." So he's like, "This is the best thing that I've ever seen. We use it. It is just astonishing." And he's just like raving to me about it for 5 minutes on how amazing the record replay, the debugger product is. And I passed it on to E too. I'm really proud of that work that E and others did there with the technology that others, me and Boris and others built.
I think that is the kind of product that it fills such a like when you can find the right solution.
Absolutely,
and hand it to the right people,
Yeah.
right? It's going to make a huge difference across industries and in the development of new technology, right?
Yeah, it was an amazing team back then, and now too, but it's like the level of talent and the level of energy was just something else where people would just drive each other to do better kind of environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you have notes that you had pulled together that we haven't hit on yet?
Yeah, the one thing I wanted to add was there was a question about what do you think is the lasting impact of VMware tech, right? So there are two different examples I can give. One small, it's actually not that small. One small and one ginormous, right? Back in 2000 time frame, when data centers, obviously data centers were underutilized. I remember a stat from product management back then. It was something between 6 to 20% was the average data center utilization back in the day. Right now, if you look at a well-run data center, we are pushing 60 to 70% easily, right? If it's well-run, it's 60 to 70%, right? So that is like, imagine just the amount of carbon savings from this, right? And that's like thanks to VMware. Like it's not possible to drive utilization to this degree without the automation and virtualization and packing servers and so on, right? So that's on the smaller side of the impact. The bigger impact, of course, is cloud. That Mendel story is still like resonates with me 24 years later. It's just astonishing. There would be no cloud without virtualization and all the attendant, APIification and automation and density and all kinds of stuff, right? So I think it's like just I'm just very grateful to be part of this evolution of VMware with just a ridiculous team. Like the team is just back then, now. Like the thing that I'm actually most appreciative of VMware is two things. Is the fact that people like Ed and Ole and Mendel sort of trusted some 25-year-old kid to go do stuff that is actually on the critical path and sort of threw me in and said, deal with it. Like this is tough to do if you're a manager, right? I'm really appreciative of that. And the other is the team. It's always been like a pleasure to work in VMware engineering teams.
As a manager now, do you try to emulate that kind of management style?
I try to. I don't know whether I'm as good as that, but I try to. For sure, I try to sort of not micromanage and like trust people. Yeah.
How do you think VMware recruited and retained that level of talent?
It's references. I don't know how to hire a team this good. I sort of personally hired so many engineers into Datrium and since then and so on. It has to be through references primarily, because you cannot build. You can get lucky with college recruiting for sure. You can get lucky, but generally speaking, my approach would be references first. If you can recruit the first 25 people or first whatever X number of people for any project through references, either internally or externally, huge step. The rest, college recruiting is great actually, because you can find really bright kids who have not done it before, so they don't know what's impossible.
Those are the best ones.
Yeah.
They're the best ones,
Yeah.
right? They'll try anything.
Yeah.
And when you say, do this impossible task, they don't know.
Just try to figure it out, right? And yeah.
I think that's it.
Thank you.
Do you have anything else?
No, I just want to thank all the engineers and product people I worked with at VMware. Really, it's been a phenomenal journey, and all the support. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ganesh.